You suggested that there might be some rationalization of even human talent.
Rationalization of human talent, meaning like layoffs in the industry.
Oh, thank you. We don't use that term on this podcast.
We're going through a rationalization of human talent.
Oh my God.
And we'd like to talk with you today, Asher.
I'm so glad I don't deal with that stuff anymore.
This is Open Work, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Riley, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Asher Rapkin, co-founder of Collective. Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California. We carry a wide range of independent brands, including Horage, Singer Reimagined, Arcanaut, and more. To learn more about us and check out our available inventory, visit collectivehorology.com.
Predictions. 2025 predictions. So last year in January, on the first ever Open Work podcast, we made predictions about 2025. We're going to do that again this year. Both you and I, same as last time. We have 3 predictions each. So predictions are all fine and well, but I do think it's important to look back and sort of grade ourselves on the predictions we made last year. One, it'll just be interesting to see what we said and how we did. But I also think it holds us to a higher standard because it means that whatever we say this year, we'll of course look at again a year from now. And it just requires us to be a bit more thoughtful. So if you're open to it, why don't I start with your 3 predictions from last year and let's see how you did.
Yeah, tell me.
Okay. So the first one was a pullback in watch media and sort of a reinvention of itself. And I think we saw that really start to happen. I think the biggest headline obviously was the Hodinkee acquisition from Watches of Switzerland. I think that in some ways represents not necessarily pullback, but consolidation. Hodinkee goes from being a separate business entity to being combined into and consolidated into Watches of Switzerland. So there's one less sort of player out there in the industry. And in this case, that one less player is Hodinkee. As far as other watch media,
one less independent player. I mean, Hodinkee's still creating content.
Right. Independent, one less player as in like its own business,
sure,
separate from all others, right? Sure. There's X number of businesses in the watch industry, and now there's X minus 1.
Which is wild because if you had asked me in January if I thought Hodinkee was going to be the one, I wouldn't have guessed it.
If you asked me 5 years ago, I would have thought the opposite would be true. I would have thought we'd be in a place, and for a while Hodinkee did acquire and consolidate other players, but I would have guessed that Hodinkee would have been the one doing the acquiring and consolidating. And I think that alone is a pretty big shift. Obviously, we've talked about it quite a bit, but that's a big one.
It is, but I think the point that I was making then, and this will flow into some of what we're going to talk about today, was also just around erosion of trust in watch media. We saw this, for example, this year in some of the pushback against Waco when he remarked, and look, I mean, you and I know Wei, and I believe this to be true, where he said that he really views his role as a journalist, essentially, I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially as a cheerleader for the industry and for really, trying to focus on the positive and not really look at the negative. But the reaction to that was extremely strong. And I think it speaks to this underlying belief that there may not be as much credibility in mainstream watch media as some wish that there was.
For sure. The other thing I think is interesting in terms of a pullback, I guess the other way I would look at this, and it's very related to what you just said, is that the journalists, the typical media outlets in the watch industry, I think have increasingly been sticking to their knitting. So I think before, there were a lot of things like Hodinkee was a good example, Revolution, all these folks, like they were moving into other business models where they were doing more and more limited editions, where they were doing retail, and they were sort of expanding beyond editorial into these other areas. And what I've seen is less of that. So I don't have a number here, but it sure feels to me that Revolution, for instance, Hodinkee as well, and probably others, are actually doing fewer limited editions than they have in the past. They're not adding new business initiatives. They're really focusing on their reporting, which maybe is something that helps with that erosion of trust. We'll see. So your second area was consolidation. This was your second prediction. And this was really around retail. And again, I think we saw this Hodinkee again being the poster child for this. Let's not forget they were a huge retailer, both in the new space as an authorized retailer and with Crown and Caliber and Hodinkee's pre-owned inventory. We also know of some independent authorized retailers who have closed their doors. So consolidation in the retail space is something that's in progress. I kind of wonder, well done. Do you think well done to you on that prediction, sadly. Is this something you see continuing, or do you think we made it through this phase?
No, and I'll talk more about this in my prediction moving forward, but I do think we will see further consolidation. Now, the question is whether or not that consolidation will be driven, well, we can talk about it for the future, but looking back, I wonder if that's consolidation from a place of power or consolidation from a place of need. And I think the book's still open on that one.
That's a great point. Consolidation doesn't necessarily mean weakness. It can happen in a strong industry when all of a sudden you have players who are flush with cash or access to capital and financing and able to make big moves. So fair enough. Okay, final area was further investment in heritage. And you pointed to Breitling's acquisition of Universal Genève as sort of a playbook you saw the industry more broadly adapting, where they would basically use heritage or heritage brands to help them move up market. That was my kind of understanding of it.
I think I'm going to give myself a big old C- on that one. I didn't see a whole lot more of that. I mean, the only thing that I saw in that space, and certainly doesn't indicate the upmarket trend, was around, say, Favre-Luba coming back and things like that. But I think that would have happened anyway at any point in the industry. So,
and that's a different playbook from 100%. UG. Favre-Luba is sort of staying in the lane they were sort of in historically, which is more accessible.
So I think I flopped that one.
I don't think so, because this was, at the time we talked about this was really new news. And I don't think anyone really knew what Breitling was going to do with UG. We knew that Breitling had acquired.
We still don't know what Breitling's going to do with UG.
We know more. And it would seem from the limited number of watches, they've made 3 watches this year.
No, literally they made 3 watches.
Okay, no, that's what I mean. Literally 3 watches. That white gold, I think it was white gold watch with that beautiful handmade bracelet. Oh my God, that bracelet is something else. But I think you were right in that you predicted that was the roadmap for Breitling with UG, which was a gambit to really move way up market. And it seems like that's what they're going to do.
Yeah,
so you did get
I don't want to go
right.
too deep into that one, because one topic I'd really love for us to cover this year is to get someone from Breitling over here to talk about UG, because there's a whole lot packed into that. But thank you for grading me on a curve on that one.
Well, I'll give you some credit. I think Breitling clearly did that. I don't know how other folks did. All right. So speaking of grading on curves, have some mercy on me.
Let me crack my knuckles here. So your first prediction was around rationalizing supply, the industry going through consolidation, production cuts. I think, we didn't see as much of this, but honestly, I think that your prediction is still probably true. It's just, it didn't happen in 24. I think it's going to happen in 25. And I do believe that, as we talked about on that first episode and ad nauseum in subsequent episodes, the impact to the industry is often on an 18 to 24 month delay from the reality of the marketplace. And I think that that's starting to catch up. We saw that a little bit at Watches and Wonders this year. I suspect we'll see it even more at Watches and Wonders next year. We listened to a really interesting podcast. You sent this to me with Tim Masso on the Standard H podcast, where he was really questioning the wisdom of having so many competitive brands within some of these larger holding companies.
Dude, come on. You're giving away my predictions now.
Well, my point is, I think your prediction from last year is a still accurate future prediction.
And I meant more consolidation in one aspect. Really, what I was focusing on was in terms of production, which is I thought that the brands would have a greater sense of what was going on in the market as a whole, meaning both the primary and the secondary market, and not flood the market with supply. And I think when you look, we just spoke with Hamza in our last episode from Watch Charts about this. When you look at the day supply of pre-owned watches, it's no longer growing and growing and growing. It has stabilized, which signifies that overall there's the industry as a whole, both across new and pre-owned, is rationalizing the level of supply versus just pumping watches through.
I think I don't know that we can make that claim at the industry level. I do think there are some players that are doing that. But that actually leads to your second point, which is around, or second prediction, which is around a retrenchment on risk taking. And you pointed out to me when we were talking about this pod, I said, well, actually, happily, that turned out not to be true. Because when we look at the independents, boy, it was 2024, a year of incredible creativity. But then you corrected me on that and pointed out you were talking about mass market watches, in which case I think you nailed it. What Rolex had?
Unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, Rolex had one stainless steel novelty, I believe, at Watches and Wonders, and it was that ghosted out bezel,
the
GMT
Bruce
Master.
Wayne.
Sure,
come on, get the nomenclature right.
Right, the Alfred, whatever. But the point is, like, yeah, I mean, Rolex the year prior had been like going buck wild with risk taking, the emoji watch, the rest of it, you know, and they really pulled back pretty heavily there. And you know, don't even get me started on the Cubitus. I mean, my God, like that right there is the perfect example of playing it so safe that you actually end up with something worse than what you already had.
Or I think another good example of this at the entire sort of brand level across a company is Bremont. I mean, boy, did they water down the drink. They went from a brand that had a very distinct point of view. And look, not everyone loved Bremont and not everyone found value in their approach to watchmaking and case making, which I really thought was the best part about Bremont, like that triptych case and the innovations they made around the cases and sort of the durability and endurance of those watches, to what now feels frankly like milquetoast.
So let me ask you a question. I don't want to spend more than like less than a minute on this, but I think I'd love your take on it, because we really, in fairness, I mean, we really had strong feedback for them in February. I'm sorry, in April when we were at Watches and Wonders. In a minute or less, can they save that brand?
No.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's necessarily about, well, from the perspective of an enthusiast, they cannot save that brand. And I think the reason why is less about the creative direction of the brand or even the watchmaking, and more like that company as a business has moved into a different chapter where it was initially founder driven under Nick and Giles, and they had a very clear idea of what Bremont was and what it wasn't, into a stage in the life cycle of that company where those two have left. I don't know if they, at least from the day-to-day operation of the business, I don't know if they still own any of the business or what, but they're out of the picture, and the suits have taken over. And the company is no longer being run by two founders with a clear creative vision. It's being run by professional shareholders, private equity investors, and I would guess quite a robust management team. And look, there are plenty of brands and businesses that operate that way and do awesome things and make great watches that people really want. But I think in that process, Bremont has really turned the page, and there's no going back.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean they won't be successful. Maybe that is a more successful approach from an overall business standpoint. But I think for watch enthusiasts, that chapter is over.
Which leads us to your last prediction before we jump into 2025, which was the reemergence of multi-brand retail and challenges for mono-brand boutiques. I think you nailed this one. We have friends who are boutique directors for mono-brand boutiques for some brands who have remarked to us that this year for them was absolutely just brutal. Which, you know, gives me no joy, by the way. But it is
consolidation from a strength standpoint, to your point, is happening in the multi-brand space.
Yes, but I do want to point out that's not an industry-wide trend. I also know of some brand boutiques that are absolutely crushing it right now. So I think it's...
Did you get your Jorn letter?
Yeah, moving on. But I think the point I want to make there is I don't think that categorically like brand-owned boutiques are in trouble. But what I do think is if your brand is already in a position where it's struggling, the mono-brand boutique
can help you.
No.
Yeah. And that was my prediction. It wasn't like multi-brand is going to win the day and mono-brand boutiques are going to be in retreat. I think what I was really just saying is like, look, we had been on this relentless path towards more and more and more and more and more mono-brand retail. And I felt that was going to cool.
Yeah.
And it has. And we've seen, like I said, the watches of Switzerland and Hodinkee is a good example of like some real consolidation and gaining strength and share. I mean, watches of Switzerland, we talk about the watch industry being in a bad place. In the US, it's really not. And Watches of Switzerland is a great example of a business that is gaining share in this country in particular, probably on the back of the fact that they have multiple brands to offer people.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think this is a question that we get asked as a retailer regularly, which is when we're we're building a relationship with a new client, they'll always want to know, well, not only what do you carry, but what else are you going to carry? And that interest of not just being called for yet another, version of the same reference, I think is very appealing to collectors. Obviously, this is a self-serving thing I'm saying here, so full disclosure on that one, but I see it, and we wouldn't have a business if it weren't true.
Well, even if you take the premise that maybe enthusiasts are buying fewer watches, and again, we could debate that on a global level for sure. In the U.S., that may or may not be true. The watch industry exports to the U.S.
I have a prediction about that.
However, but what you can't argue with is it's very appealing and it makes a lot of sense for, especially in a watch market that's consolidating or where people are maybe buying fewer watches and being more intentional about the watches they're buying. If you accept that premise, I don't know if I do, but if you do, it makes sense to have a relationship with multi-brand retailers because you don't have, we've talked about this a ton. You don't have to buy 5 watches from one brand to get the one you want. You can have a relationship with a retailer over time across a lot of brands and get access to things you're interested in. But that was then. This is now 2025 predictions. Why don't you start with the predictions?
All right, let me bust out my crystal ball here.
Prediction number 1.
All right, so I'm looking at this based on behaviors that I've seen over the last year, interactions with clients, the rest of it. I think that a certain segment of the market is in for a rough ride, while another segment of the market is slowly growing and picking speed back up. The segment that I think is going to be challenged in 2025 are the $1,000 to $10,000 watch segment. I think there's a lot of reasons for this. I mean, some of them are macroeconomic, but I also think that there is an extremely high level of expectation. I mean, let me preface, there should be a high level of expectation from clients at any price level. But in that particular price level, the expectations are extraordinarily high these days from clients. And I think that's a mixture of a relatively well-informed collector base in some ways. And in other ways, as we talked about, for example, on the movement episode, maybe putting value in places that can't live up to it in that class. Now, the good news about this is, if we look at last year's predictions, I think the creativity in that market, may end up performing really, really, really well. So I do think there are some ways to be insulated from that, being limited, being creative, being quick to market. These are the kinds of things that I think have driven the success of brands like Colloquium, for example, where they'll proudly tell you that they have not a premium grade Sellita movement. It's like a base grade Sellita movement because it's utterly irrelevant to the reality of the watch.
A red hot brand that we carry is Arcanaut.
Yep.
It's really hard to strap down those watches because what they're doing is incredibly bold and creative and at a compelling price point. So there is a playbook for being successful at that price point.
But those are two brands, for example, that have a very strong creative point of view.
And they're breaking the mold.
Yeah.
And so I think part of what you're saying here is like you see a continuation of a lack of risk taking, and that's part of what's contributing to some of this stasis.
Yeah. And I think that market, because it is so saturated and because it is so, I mean, at least in mainstream watch world, extraordinarily commoditized, I think it's going to be very brutal to compete in that if you continue on the same playbook. And, look, that's really up to those brands as to whether they believe that their core value is in consistency or whether they believe that their core value is in the exploration of what their brand can be. But I can tell you, just looking at talking to clients and, just looking at like behaviors at watch shows that we've attended, there's a lot of, cool. And not a whole lot of credit card swipes when it comes to that particular price class.
So let me ask you a question, because we don't really talk about like watch and design trends and things like that. But I think this plays a part, particularly in your point here around risk taking and what gets people out of bed. What do you think about where quote unquote, shaped watches and stone dials fit into all of this stuff?
Yeah, I think that's an outcome, not necessarily like a strategy. What I mean by that is, I think the reason that we saw like Baltic's stone dial watches or all the way up to like, Bergeon's like beautiful stone dial watches, et cetera, selling really, really, really well is that they had a strong point of view. And whether one was running on its own in-house movement and made out of precious metal and the other was running off of, what does a Baltic run off of? Do you know? It doesn't even matter. That's the point. Yeah. Is irrelevant because it looked really pretty. It had a clear perspective. It didn't look like anything else that anyone had seen before.
I guess my point is like, we've seen just so many stone dials and so many oddly shaped watches. Like, do you think that trend is getting played out? Do you think that even counts for risk taking or something that's going to excite people?
It counts for risk taking. Look, just because. And again, like I don't know much about supply chain in this context, but I have to imagine in order for people to be putting stone dials and watches that are $1,400, there were a lot of suppliers that suddenly came onto the market within the last 36 months that were able to provide that. And as a result, that area of exploration, like what a stone dial can or couldn't be, suddenly became an option. So, to me, like this is now another crayon in the box that brands can play with, and what they choose to do right now, all they were really doing was saying, look, tiger's eye. But what they choose to do with that moving forward is, I think, going to demonstrate what the potential of that crayon is. Like, I'll give you an example.
Okay.
So, and again, full disclosure, we're a retailer of fears, but when you look at the Aurora, for example, their mother of pearl dialed piece, there is a lot of detail in that dial about how they've milled it, how they've really put focus and energy into creating dynamism there outside of the natural energy of that dial. And to me, that's saying, okay, there's a lot of potential coming for stone or natural dials that we haven't yet seen.
Okay, that's fair. Like, you have to be willing, though, to do something different.
Yeah, it's like...
Or to take it as a starting point, not just put a tiger's eye or whatever in it.
And I think most brands, in fairness, are going to stop at like, look, Onyx.
Now with malachite.
Exactly.
Let me give you the cynical take on this. So One of the things that happens to us when we're at watch shows, like when we go to, say, Wind Up, for instance, most people who come to our booth, want to come check out watches and see what we have on offer. And maybe they haven't seen one of the watches we carry before. We have something special at the show and they want to come check it out, maybe even buy one, whatever. All awesome. There are also a handful of people at these shows who come to pitch their own brand and their own project they're working on. So they come up to the table, they start looking at watches. They're almost behaving like a customer. And then the discussion turns and they're actually there to pitch you something, to try to sell you something, which I think is a little unfortunate. Not because I'm not open to those discussions. It's just not the right place and the time, because that's taking away opportunity from people who are there purely as enthusiasts. However, this happens all the time.
However, but.
Yes. And one of the things that happened this year was a guy came up to our table in New York at Wind Up. And it turns out he wanted to pitch us on his new startup brand. And guess what? He had shaped watches with stone dials. And he told me, this is exactly the right watch for this moment. We're going to do very well with these. And I just started thinking to myself, okay, we've reached peak shaped dial and stone watch. Like this is it just felt very toppy, where you have people entering the industry cashing in on a trend. And there was, by the way, what you said of like,
I'm usually the grumpy cynic here. I'm like shocked.
let's take what you said as true, because I do agree with it. If you're using that stone dial or that interesting case shape or whatever, doing something different as a starting point, and you're going to offer something fresh and new and distinct, great. This was none of those things. This felt like cashing in on a trend. It felt like the shoe shine boy asking for stock tips in 1929, like, days before the Great Depression. Like, that's
hippies, man.
That's what it felt like to me. It just felt cynical, and I just don't know where this thing goes or if it has legs.
Yeah, but honestly, I feel like that's just
I don't think it's going to save the sub 10K segment of the industry.
No, honestly, I don't know what necessarily will at this particular juncture. You have mega dominant mass market brands like Tudor and, I suppose to a degree, Omega, that offer a lot of bang at $4,000 to $6,000, $7,000.
Oh yeah,
and that's just really difficult from a mass market standpoint to compete against.
Well, that's why you have to do something so different.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, before we move on, and we really should, let's take a moment to plug the Stone Dial watches on collectivehorology.com, because this would be the perfect time and place to do it. Asher is looking at me like I have three heads. I'm kidding. It's a joke. Okay, I'll give you my first prediction.
Actually, in fairness, if we're going to take the piss, we might as well take it on ourselves, too. We did make a Stone Dial watch in 2024.
We did. It was an Onyx dial watch. So yes, we did make a Stone Dial watch. We've wanted to make that.
Was
watch.
it the right watch for the time? And did we capitalize on the trend?
We didn't think about it that way. The way you and I thought about it was this was a kind of watch we had been wanting to make for over a decade.
It's true.
And we probably would have made it regardless of what was going on with Stone Dial watches. Anyway.
Fair enough.
But I can't plug those because they're sold out. All right, let me give you my first prediction, which is kind of related, which is, and maybe it's a bigger, more kind of macro thing. I think we're going to see a vibe shift this year. We have been talking for the last 2.5 years about the sea change in the watch industry and things moving from a boom time to a cooling off or a decline. We talked a lot in our last podcast with Hamza about this, which is, he mentioned that he's getting tired of every month in his watch charts digest emails saying like, I wish I had better news. Like the hardcore data about the state of the watch industry aside, it definitely feels like watch collecting just maybe hasn't been as exciting. There's more grumpiness among collectors. There's a feeling like, we just went through it with our last topic here. There's just a feeling that the industry has been in a cooling off period or a downswing for the last couple of years. I think that's going to start to change this year. I think this is the year where the tide starts to turn. And I don't know what it is that gets people there. If it's just something is in the water, or there are some new watches or exciting new watchmakers that get people's attention, or a raft of really interesting and unusual watches this year, or cool enthusiast events that get people excited again. But I do think we're going to see a sentiment shift among watch collectors and among enthusiasts around kind of the state and the health of the industry. We're going to do our survey. I guess we're going to do it twice a year now. So we'll do it again around
February.
Probably right around Watches and Wonders. I thought we were.
We want it ready for Watches and Wonders. So,
got it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, because we take everyone's data and sell it to the brands. I'm kidding. We do take the insights we get from those surveys and share it with the brands, which is important feedback. But I think we're going to start to see the tide turn this year, and frankly, I'm excited for that. I want that, not from just sort of the quote unquote health of the industry, but I want that just for the mood and the enjoyment of being a watch enthusiast. There's just been so much cynicism and frankly a lot of negativity over the past few years, and look, this is a hobby and should be fun.
I have no evidence to back that up, but I do anecdotally feel it. So I think that's the case. What will be interesting is to see where that optimism and positivity flows from, because, as we've discussed, mainstream watch media isn't necessarily the nexus of that anymore. And I think that is going to be an interesting thing to see, like what is driving it. In 3 years ago, it was almost like this weird sort of FOMO thing where it's like my passion is driven by getting a thing someone else can't have, or by knowing I can achieve it.
Great point.
Or, and now like watches are more available, not everything is readily available, of course, but like a lot of awesome watches are. So we're back to the joy coming from the, just the reality of finding something that you're passionate about and bringing that art into your life, as opposed to feeling like I got a thing that somebody else didn't. And of course, like, that's not characterizing everybody's feeling, but I do think that was an overarching trend that was part of the earlier part of this decade. Which, goes to, I think, my second prediction.
Asher's prediction. I didn't do prediction 1 for my prediction 1 ended. Prediction 2.
I do believe, and, you could say that we're biased here, and we are, but we wouldn't have a living if this wasn't true. I do believe independents are going to continue their climb, and I'm going to say something that I think we've been preparing for, but I think is true, which is I think a lot of large big box retailers are going to start. I mean, we know that they've already had an interest in independents, but I think they're going to start looking at independents more aggressively to stock in their stores. The reason why I think that is going to be a challenge for consumers and for the brands is I don't think they actually care about independent watches. I think they care about their diminishing revenues on mainstream watches, and they're just looking for something to fill it in. And I can hear people waving their fist at me from their corporate offices, but
maybe a less cynical way of looking at it.
I don't think that's cynical.
Well, let me give you a different take that's slightly less cynical. They might say, no, they wouldn't say this. They might say, okay, sure, but actually, it's not that we want these things to help with diminishing revenue. We just want something else that's interesting to offer to our customers.
Yes, but to dig into that and explain why I don't feel like it's cynical, I just feel like it's factually accurate, is let's assume you have a big box retailer or a multi-brand retailer, and that store does, let's say, $50 million annually, okay? And that store sells Rolex. They probably are doing 40 million to 45 million in Rolex in that boutique, if that's their total revenue, and everything else is 5 million. So, but it takes just as much time, if not longer, to sell an independent watch than it does a Rolex. So if you're a sales associate in one of those boutiques who is on commission, or even not on commission, but maybe gold against revenue or any number of things, you're just not going to sell those watches. And if you do sell those watches, they're going to require a lot more effort and time and knowledge to be able to do it than to sell, any number of Submariners or Aquanauts or, Etch-a-Sketch watches or whatever to a client. It's not cynicism. It's just practical reality. I mean, everyone has this in a job. Like, there's the thing that you do every day in and out, and then there's the thing that might be more interesting, but requires a lot more effort and time, and just realistically, you're not going to do it. Now, this does create some interesting dynamics, though. Let's say large big box retailer comes in and goes to a successful independent brand and says, I'm going to pour significant money into buying inventory from you, and I'm going to build you these beautiful displays in my store. And, independent watch brands may be hard pressed to say no to that, because the capital is meaningful. The exposure is not insignificant. But they'll have to then ask themselves a larger question of what are they achieving in the long term versus the near term, given the pressures that I just described. A store that makes 80 to 90% of its revenue from Rolex or Patek Philippe just simply can't afford to divert attention away from that to independents, regardless of whether they've invested $1 million in that build out and that inventory, even if that $1 million is of critical value to the independent brand that they've worked with. So I think it's going to be interesting here, because these larger retailers, you're going to have inside these corporations this push and pull, where these folks are going to be looking for ways to increase their net revenue by bringing in brands that they believe could grow their customer base. But that will be, I would argue, potentially hamstrung by the reality of the people on the ground not actually bothering to sell those watches or knowing what they're doing, because why should they, frankly, when 80% to 90% of their compensation and revenue doesn't come from that side of the store.
Yeah, we had an experience. We've talked about it on the podcast. We like to mystery shop other retailers. So whenever we travel, wherever it may be, we will roll into retailers. And we try, if we're in a market where this makes sense, we try to go to retailers who have some overlap, who maybe carry some of the same brands that we do. Now, generally, when we're traveling to big cities and things like that, this means we're going to these big box retailers. We went to one in a city. I'm not going to give it away. We went to one of them in a city which will remain unnamed at a retailer who will remain unnamed. And we asked some questions about a couple of different watch brands that we carry. And the sales associate had no idea what he was talking about. In fact, what was really sad was the sales associate didn't say, hey, I've got to be honest with you. I focus on these other brands here. Like, I don't really know about these two brands. They're independent. They're smaller in production, or I'm just not trained on them. Just made stuff up. And that was one, as an enthusiast, that outraged me, because like the watch enthusiast, the know-it-all in me is just outraged that I'm essentially being lied to about this stuff. But two, if I wasn't an enthusiast and I was a person who was coming in off the street, the use case you're talking about, like showing these watches to a larger audience in areas with a lot of foot traffic and a nice build out. If I'm just a person who sees a watch and thinks it's beautiful or is curious about it and asks, and I'm being fed misinformation, that's terrible. That's not the way to introduce the brand to a wider audience.
No, and I mean, look, that is. I've also had good experiences in big box retailers who know what they're talking about when it comes to independence, and I think the difference here.
Yes,
here's the difference,
but it's checkered.
It is. Let's say
there's a difference between walking into one of those retailers and then picking up the phone and calling us, or a guy like Martin Pulley, people who really have been champions of independent watchmaking and are heavily invested in the brands and know the product. There is a difference.
I think the point I'm making is, let's say I walk into big box retailer X, right? And a sales associate comes up to me, welcomes me, and asks me what I'm interested in, or moves me in one direction within the store. I just have a hard time seeing them moving towards the independents with 90% of the clients who come in, because let's say a client comes in and says, yeah, I'm looking for like an everyday watch. My budget is like 10 to 15K. Are they going to bring them over to brand X, Y, or Z, or are they going to bring them over to Omega and Rolex?
Yeah. Which is probably where they should bring them in that case.
Correct. Yeah. But this goes back to my original point of that is probably where and they should and would bring them, but that's not going to serve independence, even if that check looks like it might.
Yeah. Okay. So there's more than meets the eye here. It's not about just putting a brand in a nice box in a desirable location. There's much more. As you and I know, these independent brands don't sell themselves. All right. Prediction number 2B. So I'm going to say you had 2A. This is 2B. Brand consolidation. And I want to give all credit here out of the gate to Tim Masso. You referenced this earlier. He was on our friend Wesley Smith's podcast, the Standard Age podcast. They talked about many things. It was a very enjoyable conversation. Don't stop listening to this podcast, but when you're done, listen to that one next. One of the things that Tim talked about was, I think Wesley asked him, like, what do you think is the future of the watch industry? And Tim had the humility to say, I don't know. But one thing I've been thinking about a lot is like, and I'm paraphrasing here, so if I'm mischaracterizing this, please don't kill me. But essentially was that there are too many brands and we should probably expect to see a consolidation of brands. Now, he was saying this is only his opinion. This is not based on any insider information or things he knows that we don't. It's just as an observer of the industry. And that really got me going. And I sort of think there's an order of operations to industry consolidation. And the order of operations, we've already been through steps 1 and steps 2. That's like, how many stages of grief are there?
Five.
Okay. So we've been through a couple of stages here. So one of the things we talked about was a rationalization of supply, right? So we're going to see the industry hopefully try to temper the number of new watches they're putting into the market. And overall, it seems that that's happening. The day supply on the pre-owned market is remaining constant. Now, it's still quite large. There's still quite a number of watches out there on the secondary market that need to be absorbed, but the problem's not getting worse. Okay. So that's the first stage, right? We start to rationalize production. Next, we start to rationalize businesses. And we're seeing that happen first in retail. So we talked about this. There's been a consolidation of retailers. There are fewer retailers out there now than there were before. The final thing you rationalize are the number of brands. And the reason why is that is the hardest thing to do on so many levels. It's easier to slow down production. It's easier even to close, in many cases, a retail door. It's really hard for anyone, and it's a decision that can't come lightly, to decide that they're going to either spin off a brand. So let's say you're a Richemont or a Swatch Group. Kering is a great example. They did this with Girard Perregaux and UN. They decided, like, we're done here, and they spun those brands out. That is a decision you can't make lightly, because when you are a large industry player and you have a portfolio of brands, part of what you go into that portfolio of brands assuming is, look, it's a portfolio. Some things are going to be hot. Some things are going to be cool. Tastes change. Things change over time. It'll work out. One gets hot, one cools down, then the other happens. And obviously they have huge investments in this. They have people who work at these brands. So and the brands, by the way, most major watch brands are incredibly historic. So as a custodian of a watch brand, you don't take the decision lightly to close it down. Or even if you're a smaller brand, an independent brand or a micro brand, to decide to close your doors is a very personal decision. So that's why I think it's kind of the last thing that happens as the industry cleans itself up and consolidates. Which leads me to say, I think this is going to be the year, now that we've been through these other modes of consolidation, I think this is going to be the year where we start to see brands consolidate. And what that means is some may close their doors, or in some cases, these larger holding companies may decide to spin some off.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I wonder, for example, if you look at some of the, going back to my sub $10,000 thing, some of the sub 10K brands in the big holding companies, right? So like Longines at Swatch, for example, or Baume & Mercier at Richemont. If you did, or, Hamilton at Swatch, if you did push those out, or if they were sold, for example, wouldn't it be utterly fascinating to imagine what an independent Hamilton or Longines or
those
Baume
two
and
brands
Mercier
I don't think are going anywhere. Maybe Baume & Mercier.
Fine. I'm playing a thought experiment here, though, And you could make an argument, like, if you wanted to be more literal about it, we could look within the Richemont. Hang on. We could look within the Richemont portfolio, for example, and say, all right, you got Panerai and you have IWC, very different from an aesthetic standpoint, but competitive in a price points, from a price point standpoint. Let's say in this hypothetical world, Richemont says, arrivederci Panerai, and they're out the door.
And that might be the best thing for Panerai.
But bear with me. That was my point, right? Which is, if that happened, and suddenly we were like pre-Vendôme Panerai again, like, to a certain degree, that's like throwing off like all of the pressure that comes from being part of a gigantic holding company.
It gives permission, and in fact, it necessitates risk-taking.
Yeah. So, it's an interesting thought experiment, whether you're talking about, sure, I don't think Hamilton or Tag Heuer or whatever, like, none of these brands are going anywhere. But
another example would be like, what do you do, your Swatch Group, what do you do with Tissot, Mido, Longines? Not that Longines should go, but like, there's a dog pile around that price point. And
I suspect
the brands are just don't have that much differentiation.
I actually would differ. So remember where I said I think that it's troubled $1,000 to $10,000.
Yeah.
Mido and Tissot do a lot of business sub $1,000.
Yeah. Look, I don't know enough about these businesses to say they should be on the chopping block, but to me, as an outsider observer, and you gave us permission on a past episode to have informed opinions as industry observers.
Indeed.
Like, to me, I look at that and I'm like, that's just a dog pile, man. You've got a lot of brands competing. Now, unwinding it is hard because you've got retail, you've got supply chain, you've got product. It's a nightmare. It's not a decision to make lightly. But
look, I think that
there's too many brands in these holding companies.
Tim brought up the point around JLC and Lange, for example, which, they're not the same quality of watch. Well, that's not fair. They're not always the same quality of watch, but they are competing for, I think, similar collectors, which is different than Tissot, for example, which is I think is a watch that's being sold to a non-watch collector.
Sure. I want to take your example because JLC, Vacheron, Longa.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Those three brands sitting in that same holding company creates a lack of imagination. Because what happens is Richemont, I would guess, is thinking about those brands and their products at a group level. You know, I don't think they just let the brands run off and do it like.
No, Marco told us that wasn't the case.
Yeah. So let's take that. Now imagine you're JLC.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. And let's say you are fighting and clawing to reinvent yourself, to reimagine your products, to get your mojo back. Every product you present to do that, right, is then going to go and get looked at the corporate level. And you're going to get responses like, ooh, yeah, well, that's really going to step on Vacheron, or Longa's kind of in that lane. So it leads to, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy where these brands, and JLC, I think in particular, is really suffering from this. They're getting boxed in by being within that corporate structure. Again, my own opinion, I don't know. And it may be liberating, and it may lead to a renaissance to step out of that structure and have permission to do things in a context where these other brands aren't determining your future and what you can or can't do.
Fair enough. And I
do also think we're going to see some brands just go away. I don't say that lightly because these are people's jobs. And not only that, like, these are not just people's vocations. These are like people's avocations. If you started a brand and poured everything you have into it, mortgaged your house, put years or even decades of your career and your life into something, this is not to be taken lightly. But I do think we're not just going to see some spinoffs. I do think we're going to see fewer brands.
Let's see. All right, so this leads us into the final
two. Prediction 3A.
Yeah. I said it last year, and I think this year we will continue to see this. I think modern watch media, in the way that it has existed traditionally, cannot survive anymore. And now we talked about this year, and you guys can go back and listen to some episodes where we talk about the Hodinkee episodes. I think do a good job of talking about the reality, the economics of advertising and what's involved in that, and the combination of the inability to generate enough revenue to actually run a meaningful business through because of the way digital advertising is built, as well as some of the realities of erosion of trust, is leading us to a place where not only is watch media potentially no longer going to be decentralized, it simply may not exist in the way that it has for the last 15 years, which is essentially article, post, traditional content. Now, one other thing that we said last year, and I think we're going to continue to see, is there might be a pullback, for example, in traditional watch media, but we talked about decentralization of media taking over. And I do think that is continuing to happen because there's no lack of interest. We see this ourselves when we publish videos on YouTube about specific watches. There are people looking actively for that content. It's not going to go away. So the question for watch media today, in my mind, isn't, where are you going to ship all the stuff that's on your desk when your office closes? The question for watch media is, this is where people are now. People consume content differently. People want it on demand. They want it to be more specific. They want it to have a point of view. What are you going to do about that?
They don't want it to feel bought either.
Well, that's what I mean by a point of view.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And ironically,
should we remind people that today's podcast is brought to you by collectivehorology.com?
The Scheinhart Wig Company. But I think, in fairness, I think Hodinkee may actually have really kind of lucked out by being bought by Watches of Switzerland, because one thing that we pointed out in the past is part of the reason why content from Tim Mosso and the rest never gets the kind of ire that we see from others is not just that Tim is a ludicrously smart man and has encyclopedic knowledge. It's also that nobody is under any illusions that Tim is trying to do anything other than sell you a watch. And if Hodinkee is able to just admit, now that they're part of Watches of Switzerland, that they are part of the marketing team of Watches in Switzerland, either by literal extension or by intention through purchase, because like they weren't bought. Like Watches of Switzerland did not buy them because they wanted to just, give the old college, pat on the back to everyone who did a good job at Hodinkee. They bought them because they think it will help them sell more watches. Like that's it. So if they start adjusting, if they keep creating excellent content with the clear, transparent truth that the goal there is to make you into a Watches of Switzerland client, I think they actually have a really good path forward. Plus, they're
just ending up in the position they were in before. That's arguably what they did with Hodinkee.
Except that they didn't pick a lane. Now they have that option again.
So you think they need to be even more explicit?
No, my point is that when they were a retailer themselves, they were absolutely adamant that the content that they were making was utterly firewalled from the sales team, and that the two were totally different. And you consuming content on Hodinkee should in no way be construed as a reason for you to go buy this watch.
This is what they're saying about their relationship with Watches of Switzerland.
No, I get that.
They're saying the same thing.
I get it.
They have editorial independence.
Sure. My point is, rarely do you get a redo. And they have that opportunity right now.
Fair enough.
You know what I mean? So they can say, they said what they said. That's fine. People have a right to evolve and change too. And by the way, I think they will have more permission to create better content by simply saying, we're here to, we are part of Watches of Switzerland. Buying a watch from Watches of Switzerland subsidizes us. If you love this content, buy your next whatever from them. I don't know.
Okay, that's a different approach and not offensive.
But it's true. If readers of Hodinkee can be proven to drive purchases and revenue at Watches of Switzerland, then Watches of Switzerland can be convinced to flow more production dollars to Hodinkee, which will give Hodinkee the ability to create even higher quality content. And if they do that in a way that meets people where they are today in terms of how they consume their content, both from a personality and format style, I think that Hodinkee has a lot of opportunity ahead of them, because not only will it be honest and true, it's a completely understandable business arrangement.
Yeah, exactly. I certainly wouldn't begrudge on that. I think what your point is, people resent feeling like they're being played, which is, oh no, it's totally independent.
Yeah, exactly.
But click this link to buy the story.
Exactly.
Okay, so I've got a related thought, which is a bit different, actually. Although maybe what you said would fall under this. So this is prediction 3B, which is, I think we're going to see new models for creator monetization. So I'm with you. Watch media needs to be reborn. It needs to evolve. And I think as part of that, specifically, watch content creators, whether it's Hodinkee or whether it's someone on YouTube or a couple of podcasters down the street, are going to find new and different ways to monetize. And by the way, they should be able to. Everyone has the right to earn a living. And if the content they're creating or anyone is creating is worthy and worthwhile, then they should find a way, and they are entitled to make a living. Now, I say this because two things. One is we've seen the playbook, and it works questionably, which is you're a watch content creator or a blog or a publication, and then the way you really make money, because of all the challenges with advertising in the watch industry, is you start to sell stuff. You start to sell watches. You make limited editions, things like that. Now, I know this sounds like the pot calling the kettle black, but I would, hopefully people understand, before we ever made a podcast or recorded a YouTube video or anything like that, we were selling watches. We were retailing, and then the content was a way to extend that. Now, what I'm talking about is the opposite, is when you start as a creator and then you move in to find a way to monetize. And I'm drawing inspiration from other categories. So in particular, when I think about the world of cars and car content creators, there's a lot of parallels here. They have found ways to monetize their businesses, or to really create businesses that go above and beyond getting paid off of YouTube ads, which don't amount to much either. Surprise, surprise. So I'll give a couple of examples. One would be Doug DeMuro, one of the biggest car YouTubers there is, famous for his quirky car reviews. He started a business that's been very successful called Cars and Bids. It's a competitor essentially to Bring a Trailer, a little bit of a different kind of product mix that they focus on. And he created a marketplace. Another example would be Matt Farah, also in the car world. He's dabbled in the watch world as well. He has the Smoking Tire podcast and YouTube channel. He owns and built a car collecting storage facility. So West Coast, I think it's called West Coast Collectibles or West Coast Collectible Storage or whatever it is in Los Angeles. The way he monetizes his business is not just through the creation of content and making some money on ads and writing for Road and Track here and there, but like he created his own business. Mm-hmm. And these are two examples that I think are good for the watch space because of two reasons. One is like people don't really feel like these guys are trying to sell you anything. Either you have a car to store with like a Ferrari to store with Matt Farah or you don't. Or in the case of Cars and Bids, it's like either you want to go out and buy, a used vehicle on an auction site or you don't. But they also show, I think, a certain degree of imagination. Like these guys didn't, and they may have, well, I know both have in different capacities, but it's like their business isn't like selling you t-shirts or car accessories or things like that. There's a level of imagination here and differentiation for these business models that allows them to continue making the content that people want and be successful business people. And I don't know what those new business models are going to be in the watch industry, but I suspect we're going to see some content creators who go beyond selling you NATO straps or selling you watches and create businesses that are different enough that there isn't this perceived conflict of interest, which you were just talking about, but also address a fundamental need and allow them to earn a living and allow them to put their content and the intellectual property that they create really to work for them to help them earn a living.
I think that's a macro trend that we've seen in marketing in general developing over the last 5 to 10 years and is certainly in our industry too. I think
there's been a lack of imagination in the watch industry when I compare it to the others.
Yeah, but I also want to point out the examples that you're using from the automotive world. These are people with a really strong point of view, creating really interesting content, and I do think there is a difference between that and just being like a gregarious personality who knows how to use CapCut. And I don't think
question my ability to use CapCut.
I didn't call you gregarious either. But my point is like there is a difference between somebody who is being paid to make content and someone who I would argue is a genuine influencer or content creator. I think in general there's a smaller percentage of people that are really amazing content creators versus somebody that's just willing to talk about what your product is for money.
Oh, I think, yes. What I'm saying here is like there are people in the watch industry who create extremely valuable, high quality content with a real point of view that people love in large numbers.
Yeah, agreed.
And I think this is a year where we're going to see one or more break through with a business model that feels very differentiated from the business models we've seen in the past. And you know what? I welcome that because what it means is if you can build a successful business that supports or is related to your core content, that's great because those folks have a right to be rewarded and to earn a living. And I hope they can find something that's a bit more sustainable for them and provides clear value to enthusiasts. Wouldn't that be great?
I think that's about as good a place as any to cut it.
All right, so we'll see 1 year from now. We'll see how we did with these predictions. Someone help us out. If you're still out there selling NATO straps, do something else. All right. Well, this has been another episode of Open Work. It's a production of Collective Horology. You can find us online at collectivehorology.com. And to get in touch with your questions, your thoughts, your feedback, suggestions, any of it, just email podcast@collectivehorology.com.